Right now from Town Hall, Jacob Sullum joins us. Jacob, how you doing, sir?
All right, how are you?
I am excellent. I appreciate you coming on the program. You're writing about the Clinton's disdain for the Second Amendment, which, of course, we've known about for quite some time. We had the first Clinton administration and maybe perhaps the only Clinton administration where we saw the semi-auto ban put into effect for 10 years. You say on Sunday, you quote Bill Clinton, he said that, quote, you can't have a bunch of people walking around with guns.
Right. This is a kind of a strange comment because if you watch the interview, this was on CNN on their State of the Union program with Jake Tapper, and he actually asked about the high unemployment rate in Baltimore, and somehow it got around to guns. It's sort of strange to watch. Initially he sort of addressed the unemployment thing. Then he segued into why the unrest in Baltimore and other cities, people upset about excessive use of force by police. And then, so given that context, he says, when he says that you can't have a bunch of people walking around with guns, you might think he's talking about the police, right? If you're going to, be shooting people without good cause,
right,
disarm them. That seemed to be the initial impression. But then, no, it became clear that he must be talking about not cops, but other citizens walking around with guns, presumably young black men in cities like Baltimore. And then he says this is sort of like Bosnia or Kosovo. And it basically, if you have too many people with guns, it's going to end badly. So that's his thesis, right?
Right.
Which did not really, and then he gets around to talking about excessive use of force by the police again, and how you need to have a process that people trust, and clearly people don't trust the current process, and that's a problem, which I agree with, but it really has nothing to do with gun control or gun rights. So it was sort of strange, because clearly he has this deeply held view that if too many people have guns, it's going to end in chaos and violence, if not, ethnic cleansing and genocide. But clearly that's not true, right? We know that's not true because of the experience in the United States with loosening the rules for carrying guns in public. And we have, lots of experience since Florida became the first state to start doing this in the last few decades. And a whole bunch of states have followed suit. And we know that you don't have blood flowing in the streets as a result of that. There's still some controversy over exactly what impact it has on crime in terms of reducing crime, right? Mm-hmm. Whether, to what extent it's a deterrent for criminals who are thinking about mugging people or assaulting people or what have you. That's still controversial. But I think it's quite clear at this point that simply having more people with guns does not in itself lead to more violence, which is his thesis. But I think he clearly believes that, right? And it's so important to him, but he had to bring it up in a context that really was not apropos to anything.
Yeah, and and it's interesting because Clinton was president during the Rwandan genocide, which was perpetrated, and actually, relatively speaking, very few guns were used. There were a lot of machetes that were used, right? And so, to me, he should be aware just of the events that occurred during his presidency. Sure. That to blame the inanimate object is not going to get you very far.
Right, and this is a recurring theme, right, among supporters of gun control, is that the object is blamed, the object is seen as evil, inherently evil, mm-hmm. And as opposed to understanding the relevance of the context, right? Obviously, in certain contexts, with certain people, more guns will lead to more violence, right? Especially if the people who are bent on committing, crime have the weapons, and the people who are trying to defend themselves don't. That's an unfortunate situation. Mm-hmm. You don't want to have it. In fact, in cities that have strict gun control, it tends to be the situation where the criminals, do not pay attention to the laws. Law-abiding people tend to be disarmed and not able to defend themselves. So I just thought it was very striking to me, and I don't think he was all aware of how a supporter of the Second Amendment might interpret that comment. His wife is running for, I don't know if you heard, she's running for the Democratic presidential nomination, right? So you'd think he'd be a little bit careful. She herself has tried to back away from her more extreme positions concerning gun control and tried to moderate her views. And you'd think if he were aware of how that would be interpreted, he would not have said that. But what it says to me is that the culture that he inhabits and his wife inhabits does not really care about those things. Does not really care about the right to armed self-defense. Does not really care about the Second Amendment. And so it doesn't occur to them when they're discussing these things that if you blame guns per se, that will offend certain people who support the Second Amendment.
Yeah, I guess, or the other political calculation is they don't care if they offend those people because they're not going for those votes this time around. Perhaps I know back in 2008, Hillary was talking about how I love hunting. Hunting's great. Isn't the Second Amendment great for hunting? I don't know that she's going to run that same type of campaign this time around, but what's interesting, Jacob, is that you look at some of these recent polls here and you see demographic shifts in support for the right to keep and bear arms among most groups of Americans, including people who are living in urban areas, including Black Americans. The human right of self-defense is very real for people. And to say that, Baltimore, Maryland, well, it's because we have a bunch of people walking around with guns. Well, they're not concealed carry holders, as you pointed out. Maryland's got very restrictive gun control laws. In fact, they passed the Firearm Safety Act in 2013 and threw a whole bunch of new gun laws on the books, and we're still seeing this violence happen.
Yes, and they have, a discretionary permit policy, which means basically you have to prove to them you have a legitimate need to carry a gun.
And self-defense is not seen as a legitimate need.
Unless there is some kind of imminent threat that you can prove that they accept, right?
Yep.
It's basically entirely up to the authorities to decide whether you have a right to defend yourself. And they seem, Hillary and Bill seem to be okay with that because even when they talk about, to the extent they do talk about it, a right to arms or to own guns at least, they very clearly qualify. I mean, both of them have said that they support registration and licensing at the federal level. Hillary backed away from that in 2008, and it was transparent because she still believes that that's the appropriate policy. That she still supports it, but she doesn't want to say it anymore because she thinks that will alienate certain people who would otherwise vote for her. And Bill has said that if you have to register your car and get permission from the government to operate a car, then the same thing should apply to guns as well. And I don't think he's ever repudiated that position. So that's where they're coming from. And if you look at the Democratic platforms back around the time when Bill was running the first time, and then when he won a second term, they were talking a great deal about how we either need more gun control, or then when he was running for a second term, how we're so proud of the gun control that we accomplished, and very little about the Second Amendment. In fact, no reference to the Second Amendment per se. Some reference to sportsmen, sporting uses of guns, appropriate, legitimate sporting uses. No reference whatsoever to self-defense. Even later on, when they started talking about the Second Amendment, that would have been when he ran and then he ran again. There was no reference to the Second Amendment. And later on, they started to say something about that even before the Heller decision. But they didn't say anything about self-defense, which is just very striking. It's all about shooting deer.
Right.
And target shooting, right? Which is weird, for anybody who's familiar with the history of the Second Amendment, that would be their emphasis. And to this day, I don't think they've ever, the Democrats have ever produced a position statement where they say people have a right to armed self-defense, because that raises the question of, how can you reconcile that with very strict gun control policies that basically prevent people from exercising that right? And in particular, the thing that I want to talk about is the very thing that Bill was looking askance at, which is carrying guns, right? Because that's the bearing part, which is the right, to keep, which is, fine within certain limits, according to them, if you get permission.
Right.
The bearing part they have trouble with, right? Because he doesn't want a bunch of people to be walking around with guns.
Yeah.
And Hillary, clearly feels the same way, even if she won't say that explicitly now. And so that really is the cleavage, right? They don't really want to talk about self-defense, first of all. And even more so, they don't want to talk about people carrying weapons, which, is necessary for self-defense in many contexts.
Jacob, listen, it is always a pleasure talking with you, sir. I appreciate you coming on the program. Next time, please don't use the word Hillary Clinton and cleavage in the same sentence. But other than that, fantastic talking with you today, sir.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Jacob Sullum, you can find him writing at Reason Magazine, syndicated all over the country as well. And you can find his latest column at, among other places, townhall.com, the Clinton's Disdain for the Second Amendment. You can't have a bunch of people walking around with guns.